A luxury train ride through the mountains. A seasoned conductor, calm, respected, and proud of his work. But when a wealthy tourist unleashes his hate, he has no idea who he's speaking to. What starts as an insult turns into a shove. What begins as arrogance becomes a catalyst for something far bigger. One man armed only with dignity documents everything. Witnesses step forward, allies emerge, and the system built to protect power is forced to listen. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about what happens when the truth is carried like cargo steadily, unshakably, mile after mile. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it wears a uniform and speaks softly, but it changes everything. Would you have stood your ground like Marcus did? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, like, subscribe, and stay on board for more. The morning sun gently illuminated the polished exterior of the Grand Mountain Express, a luxury train renowned for its scenic tour through lush valleys and majestic mountains. Marcus Hart adjusted his conductor's cap, examining his reflection briefly in the glossy windows of the station. His uniform was pristine, each brass button gleamed, his name badge clearly displayed. He took a deep breath, satisfied that everything was in order for the journey ahead. Marcus had been a conductor for nearly 2 decades, earning his position through relentless dedication and integrity. He was respected by his peers, admired by passengers, and well known for his calm, measured approach to any situation that arose aboard the train. More than anything, Marcus valued dignity and professionalism. These qualities had seen him through challenging moments in his life, from raising 2 daughters alongside his wife, Anna, to overcoming subtle prejudices he'd encountered throughout his career. Passengers began to gather on the platform, eagerly anticipating the journey ahead. Marcus moved smoothly among them, greeting each guest politely, answering questions, and ensuring everyone felt welcome. His demeanor exuded authority tempered by warmth, exactly what passengers expected from the luxurious experience promised by the Grand Mountain Express. As Marcus completed his routine pre-boarding check, a passenger loudly cleared his throat nearby. Marcus turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed older man standing rigidly beside several expensive leather suitcases. The man's posture spoke volumes, wealthy, entitled, and accustomed to immediate service. "You there," the passenger barked sharply, eyeing Marcus dismissively. "Carry these bags aboard. I don't expect delays." Marcus glanced down at his uniform briefly, clearly displaying his role as the conductor, and calmly replied, "Good morning, sir. I'm Marcus Hart, your conductor for this journey. I'll gladly call a porter to assist with your luggage." The passenger, whose ticket identified him as Richard Campbell, looked momentarily startled. Clearly irritated by the correction, he scowled and muttered loud enough to be overheard, "Surprised someone like you is in charge here." Marcus felt a familiar sting but kept his composure perfectly intact. He had heard similar comments before, each instance fueling his determination rather than anger. With a polite nod, Marcus summoned a porter, ensuring Mr. Campbell's luggage was quickly taken aboard. Campbell continued staring at Marcus coldly, visibly annoyed at having been corrected. Marcus brushed off the incident, resuming his duties as passengers continued boarding. Soon after, he stepped aboard himself, proceeding to the conductor's station at the front of the first-class carriage to perform final safety checks and announcements. The passengers settled comfortably, champagne glasses gently clinking as attendants provided impeccable service. Marcus's clear, steady voice resonated through the speakers, officially welcoming passengers to the journey ahead. Once underway, Marcus moved gracefully through the cabins, greeting passengers individually, sharing travel details, and ensuring their comfort. His quiet confidence soothed any initial concerns passengers might have, setting a relaxed and enjoyable atmosphere. As Marcus reached Richard Campbell's compartment, Campbell leaned out aggressively, obstructing Marcus's path intentionally. "You," Campbell snapped again, disregarding Marcus's clearly displayed name, "I expect impeccable service." "You've already disappointed me once." Marcus smiled patiently, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Campbell, I assure you everyone aboard will receive exemplary service. If there's anything specific you require, our attendants will be delighted to assist." Campbell narrowed his eyes, stepping even closer. "I don't trust your kind to manage properly," he hissed, the venom in his voice unmistakable. "Maybe you'd be better suited cleaning floors instead of running this train." Several nearby passengers fell silent, discomfort visibly rippling through the air. Marcus calmly maintained eye contact, refusing to be provoked, though his heart tightened at the blatant humiliation. "Sir," Marcus replied with composed authority, "our train operates on mutual respect. I kindly ask you to extend the same courtesy everyone else aboard is displaying." The confrontation attracted discreet attention. Passengers glanced curiously, some shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by Campbell's harsh tone and offensive words. But Campbell seemed unconcerned, emboldened by his perceived superiority. "Respect," Campbell scoffed loudly. Respect is something earned, not given to just anyone who wears a uniform. I paid good money to be here. I won't have my trip ruined by incompetence. Marcus took a careful breath, fully aware that he needed to handle the situation without escalating further. Your comfort is important, sir, Marcus responded evenly. I suggest you relax and enjoy the scenery. Let's ensure this journey remains pleasant for everyone. Campbell snorted derisively, stepping aside just enough for Marcus to pass but clearly intending it as an insult. As Marcus walked by, Campbell deliberately shouldered him forcefully, causing Marcus to stumble awkwardly into the edge of the seat beside him, bruising his arm. Gasps came from nearby passengers. Marcus steadied himself, breathing deeply to quell the surge of humiliation and pain, determined to maintain his professional demeanor. A woman passenger quickly stood, alarmed. Are you all right, Mr. Hart? She asked kindly, clearly distressed by what she'd witnessed. Marcus straightened his uniform calmly, offering a reassuring smile despite the dull ache radiating from his arm. Yes, thank you, just a minor misunderstanding. Everything's fine. But everything was not fine. Marcus knew this had crossed a significant line. The moment demanded careful handling. He paused briefly to discreetly ask two nearby passengers if they'd witnessed the incident clearly. Both nodded solemnly, offering their support. Marcus then quietly excused himself, walking deliberately to the conductor's private cabin. There, he carefully documented the encounter, time, location, passengers present, and the extent of his injury. His years of professionalism had taught him the importance of precise documentation, especially when facing prejudice hidden within privilege. Deep within, Marcus felt familiar pain, recalling countless times he'd been judged or underestimated solely by his appearance. Yet, each incident strengthened his resolve. This was no different. The journey had just begun, but Marcus already knew it wouldn't simply be a trip through beautiful landscapes. It would become a voyage toward dignity, justice, and the systemic change that was long overdue. As the mountains and valleys rolled gently by outside, Marcus prepared himself for what lay ahead. This moment, uncomfortable as it had been, was merely the start of something larger, something important, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever felt invisible or undervalued. Marcus stepped back into the bustling carriage, his arm still throbbing slightly from the encounter with Richard Campbell. Despite the discomfort, he maintained his composed exterior, gently reassuring passengers who offered sympathetic glances as he passed. Marcus knew that maintaining his professionalism was crucial, especially now. He made his way toward the dining carriage, where Jonathan Cole, an executive known for his quiet authority and fairness, was seated. Jonathan was traveling incognito, assessing the quality of service on board the Grand Mountain Express. Marcus discreetly approached his table, offering a polite nod. Good morning, Mr. Cole. How are you enjoying your trip so far? Marcus asked evenly, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. Jonathan looked up, sensing Marcus's subtle urgency. It's been excellent so far, Marcus, though it seems you've had a rough start. Care to sit for a moment? Marcus hesitated briefly before nodding and taking a seat opposite Jonathan. He glanced around cautiously, ensuring their conversation remained private. I appreciate your concern. Unfortunately, we had an issue with one of the passengers. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his expression turning serious. I noticed the incident earlier. Are you all right? Marcus nodded reassuringly. Physically, yes, but I must address this properly. It's about setting the right standard, not just for myself, but for everyone on board. Jonathan nodded understandingly. Absolutely. You handled it remarkably well, Marcus. Rest assured, I'll support you fully in whatever steps you decide to take. Marcus felt a wave of relief. Jonathan's reassurance was significant. Having the backing of someone in his position would make navigating the official channels smoother. After briefly discussing next steps, Marcus thanked Jonathan, rose calmly, and resumed his duties. Throughout the day, Marcus continued checking in with passengers, ensuring their comfort and enjoyment. However, his interaction with Richard Campbell lingered in his mind, demanding further action. Quietly, between routine checks, Marcus began gathering additional testimonies from witnesses who had seen Campbell's behavior. Each passenger he approached expressed clear support and confirmed they were willing to provide statements. By late afternoon, Marcus had methodically documented substantial evidence. Feeling confident, he returned to his conductor's cabin, carefully organizing his notes and witness statements. Yet beneath his steady exterior, Marcus grappled with a deeper sadness. Despite years of professional experience, encounters like today's still hurt deeply, reminding him of society's persistent prejudices. As evening settled, the scenery outside shifted dramatically, mountains bathed in the golden hues of sunset. Marcus stepped out onto the observation deck, taking a moment to collect his thoughts and steady himself. The beauty surrounding him was a stark contrast to the ugliness he had encountered that morning. Quite a view, isn't it? Came a gentle voice behind him. Marcus turned, surprised to see an elderly woman standing close by, gazing out appreciatively. She had introduced herself earlier as Evelyn Ross traveling with her husband. Her warm eyes regarded Marcus kindly, filled with genuine concern. "Yes," Marcus replied softly, smiling gently. "It's one of the reasons I love this job." "You handled yourself remarkably today," Evelyn continued quietly, keeping their conversation discreet. "I saw what happened. My husband and I are willing to help if you need our statements." Marcus nodded gratefully, his heart warmed by her sincerity. "Thank you, Mrs. Ross, that means a great deal to me." "It's important that people see these things and speak up," Evelyn said firmly. "Prejudice flourishes in silence. You've set a powerful example today." Her words resonated deeply, reaffirming Marcus's resolve to address this matter thoroughly and professionally. After exchanging a few more pleasant words, Marcus escorted Evelyn back inside, ensuring she comfortably rejoined her husband. The night fell gently upon the Grand Mountain Express. Inside, passengers enjoyed gourmet meals, soft music drifting through the carriages. Marcus discreetly observed Richard Campbell from a distance, noting that the man's attitude remained arrogantly unchanged. Yet Marcus felt empowered rather than intimidated. The support from passengers like Evelyn Ross and the backing of Jonathan Cole reassured him that justice was achievable. Late in the evening, Marcus returned to the conductor's cabin, preparing his official report meticulously. Every detail mattered: dates, times, names, precise descriptions of Campbell's behavior, and detailed witness statements. Marcus understood the power of documentation, knowing it could influence not only his case but also policies within the company. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jonathan Cole stepped inside quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down gently in front of Marcus, sitting nearby. "Thought you might appreciate this," Jonathan said warmly. Marcus smiled gratefully, taking a careful sip. "Very thoughtful, thank you." Jonathan leaned back, his expression serious yet reassuring. "Marcus, I've made discreet inquiries today. It appears this isn't the first complaint about Mr. Campbell. There are previous incidents, all downplayed due to his status, but I promise you that ends here." Marcus met Jonathan's steady gaze, feeling deeply reassured. "Knowing I have your support and the evidence we've gathered is truly encouraging." "You deserve full backing," Jonathan affirmed decisively. "And more importantly, the company needs to confront this issue openly and effectively. I'll ensure that happens." Their quiet conversation lasted well into the night, solidifying their strategy. When Jonathan left, Marcus finalized his report, satisfied he had done everything possible to ensure truth and accountability. As the train continued its graceful journey through the night, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He knew the coming days would challenge him, but he was ready. This was more than a personal confrontation. It was about dignity, fairness, and meaningful change. Marcus understood clearly now, this wasn't merely about one unpleasant passenger. It was about standing up for every employee who had faced disrespect or prejudice silently, afraid to speak out. With a determined breath, Marcus closed his notebook, prepared for whatever the next day would bring. His journey toward justice had begun, guided by integrity and the unwavering belief that true professionalism and dignity would ultimately prevail. The morning after the incident dawned cold and clear, the Grand Mountain Express slicing smoothly through dense alpine forests as soft light spilled across the snow-dusted peaks. Marcus' heart woke early, just before his alarm, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a reel stuck on loop. There was no sense of regret, only the clarity of knowing that what he had done was right, and that what came next would require the same quiet strength. He showered, dressed carefully, and reviewed the detailed report he had completed the night before. Every piece of documentation was accounted for, every witness statement verified and signed. He placed everything neatly into a secure folder, then slipped it into his satchel. The day ahead would bring conversations, questions, perhaps resistance, but Marcus was ready. Stepping into the corridor, Marcus moved with his usual grace and professionalism. He greeted passengers as they stirred, some preparing for breakfast, others simply enjoying the unfolding scenery. A few offered subtle nods or quiet acknowledgments, gestures that told him the incident hadn't been forgotten, and neither had the dignity with which he'd handled it. In the dining car, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air. Marcus walked through slowly, checking on guests as he always did. When he reached Evelyn and Thomas Ross's table, they looked up with warmth. "Mr. Hart," Thomas said, setting down his cup, "we were hoping to see you this morning. We've written out our statements just as we discussed." Evelyn handed over the folded papers. "Everything we saw, just as it happened. If there's anything more we can do, don't hesitate to ask." Marcus accepted the papers with quiet gratitude. "You've already done more than enough, thank you truly." They exchanged a few more kind words before Marcus continued on. Further down the carriage, he encountered another couple who had witnessed the altercation. They too had prepared a statement. By mid-morning, Marcus had collected more than half a dozen detailed witness accounts. Each one painted the same picture: a conductor carrying out his duties with calm professionalism, and a man whose behavior was rooted not in misunderstanding, but in deep-seated contempt. Near the end of the second carriage, Marcus spotted Richard Campbell alone at a small table. He was sipping a dark liquor despite the early hour, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Their gazes met briefly. Campbell's expression hardened. Marcus didn't stop or engage. There was nothing more to be said, not directly. The time for words between them had passed. Now it was about process, truth, and accountability. Later that morning, Marcus met with Jonathan Cole in the private observation lounge. Jonathan had set up a quiet corner with a small table and fresh documents spread before him. He looked up as Marcus entered. "Morning, Marcus. Come sit. I've spoken with company leadership. They're taking this seriously." Marcus took a seat, setting his own file down beside the others. "That's good to hear. I've collected several more statements." Jonathan opened the folder, flipping through the papers. "Excellent. Every account strengthens the case. What's especially compelling is how consistent they are. No ambiguity, no conflicting details." They spent the next hour cross-referencing documents, assembling a clean and concise file to submit formally to the company's internal ethics committee. Jonathan explained that he had already notified the director of passenger experience and the company's legal advisor. A meeting would be arranged shortly after the train returned to headquarters. As they worked, a knock interrupted them. A porter stepped in, clearing his throat. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Hart. Mr. Campbell is asking to speak with you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He exchanged a glance with Jonathan, then shook his head. "Tell him I'm occupied with company matters. If he has anything to say, he can do it through official channels." The porter nodded and left. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, not going to entertain another confrontation. "No, that's what he wants, something emotional, something he can twist. I've said all I need to say, and everything else will go through the proper process." Jonathan smiled approvingly. "Smart." The remainder of the day passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. Passengers lounged, read novels, took in the scenery, but a quiet tension traveled through the carriages. Word had spread about the incident. The hush around it was not silence but anticipation, people waiting to see what would happen next. As the train began its final descent toward its last scenic stop before the return leg, Marcus stood on the platform overseeing the short layover. He watched passengers disembark to stretch their legs and take photos of the panoramic views. When Campbell stepped onto the platform, Marcus noticed how his expression had changed. There was still arrogance, but it was now tinged with uncertainty. The power dynamic had shifted. Campbell no longer had control of the narrative. His actions had been seen, documented, and discussed. He was no longer the unquestioned authority in the room. The looks he received from other passengers were no longer ones of admiration but quiet judgment. Marcus didn't speak to him. He didn't need to. That evening, as the train rolled into twilight, Marcus reviewed the final version of the incident file. Everything was in place. Jonathan would personally escort the file to the company headquarters the moment they returned. A formal review board had already been convened. Alone in his cabin, Marcus allowed himself to exhale. He knew this wasn't over. There would be denials, perhaps pushback. He would likely face scrutiny not only from Campbell's camp but potentially from those within the company uncomfortable with change. But he had prepared. He had documentation, truth, and the quiet strength of knowing he had done the right thing. More importantly, he had not wavered, not when insulted, not when pushed, not when provoked. The case was no longer just his. It belonged to every staff member who had watched silently as a colleague was mistreated. It belonged to the passengers who had come forward. It belonged to the company now, and what it chose to do with the truth would speak volumes about what it valued. As the Grand Mountain Express pushed deeper into the night, the stars scattered above like soft embers, Marcus sat beside the window, watching them drift in and out of sight. He thought of his daughters, how they would grow up in a world where these battles still had to be fought. But he also thought of what it would mean for them to see their father stand firm, to see dignity answer hatred and integrity stand taller than arrogance. He wasn't done. The real fight was just beginning, but for now he had done what was right. And that, Marcus knew, was how change always began, one man, one stand, one truth at a time. The Grand Mountain Express pulled into the final station just after noon the following day, its engine humming low as the train came to a graceful halt beneath the tall iron canopy. Marcus stood at the front of the first-class car, tipping his cap politely as passengers began to disembark. Some shook his hand in quiet support, others nodded with soft expressions that said more than words ever could. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. They had seen what mattered. Richard Campbell was among the last to leave. His posture was still upright, his tailored coat still sharp, but something in the way he moved had changed. He kept his eyes ahead, offered no final words, and stepped off the train without a glance back. It was a quiet exit for a man used to commanding rooms. Marcus remained on the platform until the last passenger departed, then turned back into the empty carriage. The silence inside the train was a stark contrast to the days before. No idle chatter, no clinking glasses or soft piano from the lounge. He welcomed the stillness. He needed it. In the company office later that afternoon, Marcus sat across from two officials from the ethics committee. Jonathan Cole sat beside him, the file open between them. Every detail was there. Witness accounts, time logs, medical verification of the bruise on his arm, and the official incident form Marcus had completed that night. No one in the room questioned the facts. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Rhodes, listened carefully as Marcus walked through the events again. Her questions were firm but fair, aimed not at doubting him but at establishing clarity. When Marcus finished, she tapped a pen lightly against the file. "Mr. Hart, your handling of this matter was measured, professional, and thorough. I see here you've declined medical compensation, is that correct?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "My concern is about accountability and ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else." Dana nodded. "That's admirable. We've already reached out to several of the witnesses independently. Their accounts align exactly." She turned to Jonathan. "And Mr. Cole, your role as executive witness and your notes corroborate all submitted materials." Jonathan nodded. Without hesitation, Dana closed the folder. "We'll be recommending formal action to upper management. Mr. Campbell's history with the company, his previous complaints, his pattern of behavior, it's all documented now. This won't be swept aside." Marcus said nothing for a moment. He hadn't come for promises. He had come to ensure the truth was in the open. The fact that others were willing to carry it forward now, to act on it, mattered. Outside, the city had begun to darken, dusk settling over the streets as lights flickered on in the office towers. Marcus left the building quietly, coat folded over one arm, briefcase in hand. The air was brisk, but he welcomed the bite. It kept him grounded. He called Anna, his wife, and told her he was on his way home. Her voice was a balm, warm and steady. She had always known the weight he carried on some of these trips, the way respect was never given but something to be proven over and over. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "We're proud of you, dinner's waiting." The following day, news broke. The company released a statement acknowledging the incident, confirming that a formal review had taken place, and announcing new measures aimed at preventing future occurrences. Diversity and conduct training would be mandatory for all luxury route passengers and staff. A dedicated channel for reporting misconduct would be introduced. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned in the statement, but the implications were clear. The story picked up steam online. A few news outlets ran short features. The headline wasn't about scandal. It was about quiet professionalism, a worker's calm response to hate, and a company being forced to reckon with its silence. Over the next few days, Marcus received a steady stream of messages. Some came from colleagues thanking him for what he did. Others were from strangers, porters, stewards, even conductors on other lines, sharing their own stories of being spoken to like they didn't belong, of being dismissed, ignored, or worse. One message simply read, "Thank you for standing up without shouting. You gave us a voice." Back at work, things shifted subtly. People made more eye contact. Supervisors acknowledged him by name more often, sometimes with a pause that suggested they were seeing him with new eyes. He didn't need applause, but he noticed the difference. A week later, he received word that Campbell had formally withdrawn from his travel membership with the company. Rumor had it he'd been pressured to do so, his status now a liability rather than a shield. Marcus didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. But he did feel something settle inside him, like a scale tipped ever so slightly toward fairness. That weekend, Marcus took his daughters to the park. They ran ahead while he and Anna walked slowly behind. The trees were beginning to blossom, the promise of spring in every breeze. "You okay?" Anna asked gently. "I think so," Marcus replied. "It's not over, not really, but it feels like the start of something." She looked at him with that knowing calm she always had. "You did right, you stayed true. That's what they'll remember, that's what matters." Marcus watched his daughters climbing the jungle gym, laughing loudly, free and unaware for now of how the world might one day treat them differently. He hoped they wouldn't face the same battles. He hoped the stand he had taken and the system that had been forced to respond would move things just a little for them. Maybe that was all he could do. Maybe that was everything. 2 weeks passed. The echo of the incident aboard the Grand Mountain Express still lingered within the company's halls, like a current just beneath the surface. Marcus Hart continued working his routes, maintaining the same steady professionalism that had earned him his position, though the air around him had undeniably shifted. Conversations quieted when he walked by. Respectful nods came more frequently. Still, he sensed that the deeper response, the one that mattered, was only beginning. At the central office downtown, A series of internal meetings had begun to assess the broader implications of the incident. The ethics committee had submitted their recommendations, a review of passenger conduct policies, training modules for staff and customers alike, and a public acknowledgement of historical complaints that had been mishandled. These were bold suggestions for a company known more for elegance and tradition than transparency. Jonathan Cole had been promoted quietly. His involvement in handling the complaint had raised his profile internally. More importantly, it had earned him trust from employees who had long felt ignored. He used this new influence wisely, pushing not only for reforms but also for direct communication between frontline staff and corporate decision-makers. He brought Marcus's name up often, never as a hero, but as an example of how calm integrity could shake loose change. Meanwhile, Marcus remained measured. He hadn't asked for attention, and he didn't seek validation. He still reported for work early, signed off his duties with care, and checked in on his colleagues as if nothing had changed. But in private, he monitored the shifts quietly taking place across the organization. One afternoon, as Marcus was preparing to board another luxury route, he was approached by a younger conductor named Theo. Nervous, hesitant, Theo stood holding his cap in both hands like it might blow away. "Mr. Hart, can I talk to you for a second?" Marcus turned to him with a reassuring nod. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Theo glanced around, then spoke in a low voice. "I just wanted to say I saw how you handled everything, and I wanted you to know it helped me. I've had a few moments, nothing like that, but moments where I felt like speaking up would make things worse. Now I don't feel that way anymore." Marcus nodded, his voice even. "You don't have to shout to be heard, but you do have to stand. Quiet strength can be louder than anything else." Theo smiled faintly, then straightened his shoulders. "I'm trying to remember that, thank you." That night, as the train made its slow ascent into the foothills, Marcus stood once again at the head of the first-class car. The same polished wood, the same soft carpet, the same sweeping windows, but something intangible had changed. Not just in him, but in the way the space felt, less fragile, more honest. He spent part of the journey reviewing the new passenger conduct brochure. It was a draft, sent discreetly to him by Jonathan. Marcus read each line carefully. For the first time, the company had inserted explicit language about dignity, anti-discrimination, and expectations for passenger behavior toward all staff. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. As the train curved along the edge of a vast, pine-dotted lake, Marcus folded the brochure and tucked it into his pocket. He looked out the window, watching the water shimmer in the golden hour light. It reminded him of the first time he had ever worked a luxury route so many years ago. Back then, he'd kept his head down, trying to be invisible enough to be accepted. Now, he didn't need to shrink himself to fit into the room. The room had begun to shift around him. The next morning, he was called into a meeting with the company's chief operating officer, a formal setting, large office, glass walls, the kind of space where policies were written and reputations decided. Marcus arrived on time, as always. Jonathan was already seated at the conference table. The COO, a serious man named Alan Pierce, stood as Marcus entered. "Mr. Hart, thank you for coming. Please sit." Marcus did. Alan remained standing for a moment longer before he spoke. "I won't pretend this is routine. You forced this company to look inward in a way it hasn't before. That's uncomfortable but necessary. I've read every report, every statement, and I want to apologize, not just for what happened on that train, but for every time we let something like that slide." Marcus listened quietly. The words mattered, but only if followed by actions. Alan continued, more measured now. "We're implementing the recommendations. Training is mandatory starting next quarter. We've opened a new reporting channel for staff, one that connects directly to the ethics board, and we're establishing a rotating advisory group of frontline employees to review policy decisions. We want you to be on that panel if you're willing." Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at Jonathan, who simply nodded in quiet support. "I'll do it," Marcus said at last, "but I'm not interested in lip service. If I sit at that table, I expect to be heard." Alan gave a small smile. "You will be, that's the point." The meeting ended not with ceremony, but with clarity. Marcus left the office feeling neither triumphant nor suspicious, just grounded. He hadn't demanded change, he had expected it, and now it seemed others were beginning to expect it too. On his way out, Marcus stopped by a staff lounge where a few conductors and engineers were taking a break. They nodded to him. One of them, an older man who'd been with the company even longer than Marcus, raised his coffee cup slightly. "We've been watching," he said simply, "and we're with you." Marcus nodded in return. Then he stepped outside into the early evening light, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. The sun was beginning to fall, casting the sky in a haze of pink and gold. He thought again of his daughters, of the conversations they would one day have about dignity and justice and knowing when to speak. And when not to, not every battle needed shouting. Some needed patience, precision, and the kind of strength that didn't waver when no one was watching. As Marcus walked toward the train yard, the sound of distant whistles and engines filled the air, familiar and grounding. He had trains to run. But now he also had a seat at a different kind of table. He would carry himself the same way he always had, with quiet resolve, with documentation, and with faith in the long arc of justice. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but it was finally headed in the right direction. Months passed, and the snow that once dusted the mountains gave way to wildflowers and soft green fields. The Grand Mountain Express kept its steady rhythm across the seasons, rolling through forests, beside rivers, and across the high ridges where the sky stretched endlessly. Marcus Hart remained at the helm, unchanged in his dedication, but not untouched by the progress unfolding quietly around him. He now split his time between the tracks and the advisory panel created in response to the incident. The meetings were held twice a month, tucked into a modest conference room at company headquarters, and though the surroundings were plain, what happened inside those walls was anything but. Employees from different roles, conductors, engineers, porters, stewards, shared space with executives and legal staff. For the first time, the conversations were real. At first, Marcus had kept his contributions brief. He wasn't there to perform. But over time, he realized that his voice, when calm and clear, was often the one that shifted a room. People listened not just out of respect, but because he came with facts, with patterns, with the lived experience that could no longer be sidelined. At one meeting, a young engineer named Celia spoke about a pattern of uneven disciplinary actions, infractions from white employees handled informally while workers of color faced formal write-ups for lesser issues. The room was quiet as she spoke, her voice trembling only once. When she finished, all eyes turned to Marcus. He didn't jump to respond. He just nodded at Celia and asked her to share her documentation. She had it, and when they reviewed it together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. This became the rhythm of their work: truth and action. Outside those rooms, the effects began to ripple. The company introduced anonymous reporting tools. Monthly equity reviews were established. Complaints were no longer routed through single gatekeepers. The staff began to feel the shift, not overnight and not without tension, but enough to notice. Jonathan Cole continued to lend his weight behind the scenes, helping ensure the reforms didn't get buried under bureaucracy. He still checked in with Marcus, often with quiet updates and a knowing look that said, "We're not done yet." Meanwhile, Richard Campbell remained a ghost in the margins of all this change. He had retreated from public view, but not without leaving traces. A journalist had requested access to the case file through unofficial channels and reached out to Marcus for comment. Marcus declined. He had no interest in turning the story into something it was. He told the truth. The truth had done its work. Then one evening, as Marcus prepared to close the door on another long ride, he received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, the paper thick and expensive, the script formal. It was from Campbell. Marcus read it once, then again. The letter did not offer an apology, at least not in the way most would expect. It was careful, perhaps rehearsed. Campbell acknowledged that his behavior had consequences, both for himself and for the company. He admitted that what he had seen as harmless entitlement had been exposed for what it truly was. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't seek redemption. He only said, "I have learned something about myself that I cannot unsee. That knowledge will never leave me." Marcus folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. He told no one, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered only to him. Some reckonings came quietly, and not every wound needed to be displayed to be healed. Back on the train, things found a new rhythm. Marcus noticed how staff now corrected small things more openly, how guests were spoken to with the same warmth but also with clear boundaries. The deference that once hung in the air like fog had lifted. In its place was something closer to mutual regard. One evening, as the train made its climb along the high ridge where the stars came out early, Marcus found himself standing near the lounge windows, watching the sky. A young porter named Devin approached, hesitant but curious. "Mr. Hart," he said, "can I ask you something?" Marcus turned, nodding. "Of course." "How did you know it would work out, that they'd listen?" Marcus looked back at the stars for a long moment before answering. "I didn't." Devin looked surprised. "But you acted like you did." "That's the job," Marcus said. "You carry the weight anyway, even when you're not sure, because it's not just your burden, you carry it for the ones who can't." Devin nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Marcus clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Just do your job right, keep records, speak the truth, and trust that someone will hear you, eventually." Later that night, Marcus returned to his cabin. He sat down at the small desk, pulled out his notebook, and made a few entries. Not about complaints or incidents, just observations. Things that had improved, things that still needed fixing, the balance between hope and vigilance. He looked at the photo pinned to the inside of his locker. His daughters smiling, arms around each other at the edge of their school's playground. He thought about the world they were inheriting, thought about how each action, however small, added up to something larger. The Grand Mountain Express rolled forward into the darkness, its lights glowing softly along the track. In the quiet hum of the rails, Marcus felt a kind of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of momentum. The kind that comes when change is no longer a hope, but a process underway. He closed his notebook, leaned back, and let the movement of the train steady his thoughts. The journey wasn't over, but it was his, and he would see it through. The year turned quietly. Spring deepened, spilling over into early summer, and with it came a sense of settling. Not stagnation, but rooting. The kind that comes after storms when the ground is still wet but the skies have cleared. Marcus Hart had not sought to become a symbol, and yet he'd become one. Not in headlines or speeches, but in policy memos, revised handbooks, and in the daily decisions made by people who had finally begun to see what they had once overlooked. The advisory panel continued its work, now with a rotation of new faces. Marcus had stayed on longer than he originally planned at the board's request. They valued his steadiness, his refusal to sensationalize, his way of speaking plainly when others hesitated. But he was ready to pass the baton. Change, he believed, must belong to more than one voice. At the final meeting he attended, Marcus sat quietly as a young woman named Camille, a steward from the West Coast Line, presented a proposal for a formal mentorship program between veteran staff and new hires. She spoke with a quiet kind of urgency, her voice full of lived moments that didn't need elaboration. When she finished, there was a pause. Marcus raised his hand. "It's a good idea, but make sure it's real, not just a box they check during onboarding, make it count." Camille nodded. "That's the goal." He saw something in her, a fire shaped not by outrage but by resolve. The same fire he had carried for years, now burning in someone else. It was time. After the meeting, Jonathan caught up with him in the hallway. "You sure about stepping down?" Marcus smiled. "Absolutely. This isn't mine to hold forever, and you've got more than enough voices in there who know what they're doing." Jonathan extended a hand, but Marcus pulled him into a brief, firm embrace. A quiet understanding passed between them. No thanks needed. No titles required. Just mutual respect earned the long way. Back on the train, Marcus settled into the rhythm of long routes and quiet mornings again. The simplicity of the job felt more valuable now. Greeting passengers, checking logs, reviewing schedules, these small acts still mattered, still shaped the journey. On one ride near the end of a 5-day excursion, a young mother approached him with her son in tow. The boy, no older than 10, clutched a notebook tightly to his chest. "He's doing a school project on trains," she explained. "And he wanted to include a real conductor. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Marcus knelt slightly to meet the boy's eyes. "Of course, what would you like to know?" The boy looked shy, but his voice was steady. "Have you ever had to deal with something really unfair, like someone being mean to you just because?" Marcus didn't flinch. He smiled gently. "Yes, I have." "What did you do?" "I told the truth. And I didn't let it change the way I do my job." The boy nodded slowly, then scribbled something in his notebook. Later, after they disembarked, Marcus watched the mother guide her son down the platform. The boy turned and waved, and Marcus waved back. It was a small moment, but it stayed with him. That evening in his cabin, Marcus found himself writing, not a report, not a memo, but a letter, not addressed to anyone in particular, just words he needed to say out loud. He wrote about the silence that often follows injustice, not because people don't care, but because they don't know how to respond. He wrote about the temptation to shout and the greater strength it takes to remain steady. He wrote about how change isn't always visible. Sometimes it arrives in the way someone speaks up during a meeting or in the way a new employee feels comfortable enough to ask a hard question on their first day. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Maybe one day he'd share it. Maybe not. Weeks later, at a company event celebrating employee milestones, Marcus stood in the back of the room, content to stay out of the spotlight. But as the speeches wrapped up, the CEO stepped to the podium and spoke his name. "Marcus Hart," he said, "has shown us what quiet leadership looks like. His actions challenged us to be better. His example reminded us of the values we say we hold. And his legacy will be felt in every carriage, on every line, for years to come." The applause was long and genuine. Marcus walked to the stage only because he was asked, accepted the plaque with grace, and said nothing more than "thank you." That night, he returned home to his family. Anna met him at the door, arms already open. His daughters had drawn posters that said, "We're proud of you, Dad," with glitter glued to the corners. He sat with them on the floor, laughing, telling them stories about the trains he'd worked on, the routes he'd memorized by heart, the mountains that never stopped taking his breath away. He told them that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it means standing still while everything tries to move you, and you don't let it. A month later, Marcus quietly submitted his notice of intent to retire the following spring. Not because he was tired, but because he was ready. He had done his part. He had helped build something lasting. As the train crested the last ridge of another long route, the sun sinking behind the trees, Marcus stood at the front, hand on the rail, looking forward. Ahead, the track gleamed, still stretching, still winding, still worth following. He didn't know what the next journey would be. But he would take it the same way he had taken every step of this one, with patience, with purpose, and with the quiet certainty that doing the right thing, even once, can echo far beyond the moment. And that echo, he knew, was still traveling.